All right. We're pretending this is the first one we did today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You want to start? You want to?
Sure, yeah, okay. Yeah, so as Ryan says, these are Aaron episodes, so I get to actually do stuff.
As I will say next episode.
Right. So we're going to introduce our guest. This is Matthew. He is my college roommate, really close friends with Ryan. We spent 4 years of our time with him at Texas A&M. Me and him were both chemical engineers. So we went to a lot of our classes together, and he's
I'm the reason
married.
you passed.
Yeah, he's the reason I passed all of my classes. And he's currently married and lives in Dallas with his wife. Yeah, so I don't know, is anything?
Yeah, I'm excited to be on the podcast. First guest.
For the first time.
First guest ever, so it's quite the honor. So I you.
Your other friends. Pope Francis.
So I was recording a mistake.
Yeah. Right. All $0 that video.
So.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ryan, I think he's also a Vikings fan, so I wore this just a little bit.
I don't care about Vikings.
Alright. So this episode I wanted us to do a little religion and politics kind of podcast.
Always a good
topic. Yeah, I knew I like to keep things like pretty like low key, and I know Ryan really likes to. So I had to get out a plan for this one before.
And then I'm usually here playing the mediator a little bit. So
yeah. So the route that I really want to go with this is I don't really want to talk. I mean, if there's current events that are applicable, like go for it. But
like an election, hypothetically.
Yeah. Okay.
If there were
hypothetically an election like a month or something.
This is who you have to vote for.
But I really want to talk about what the nature of politics is in like Catholic thought and how people are misinterpreting that. I feel like recently there's been a lot of people that tend to put politics, especially in the United States,
right.
People that hold politics up as sort of a false idol, right?
Right. Yeah.
And obviously they probably don't recognize that in the way that we're speaking about, like, I don't like worship politics, but they take politics to be something greater than it is intended to be. And I don't want to step on either of y'all's feet. So y'all both had really good thoughts about this. So just talk a little bit about what politics is intended to be in Catholic thought versus, what the world kind of puts it under.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know when he first asked me to come on the podcast and this was the topic, I was like, oh boy. But no, the first thing I really thought of was like, politics is simply a means to an end, and it's and in a lot of sense, it's like it's just a way to express your beliefs for society, but it's also just like it's a means to an end. It's a means for those who cannot be taken care of to be taken care of. Really, like it's really what it should be from Catholic view, and like and to what varying degrees is obviously why it gets all complicated because there's tons of disagreement on to what level that and who and all that. But in the end, it's a means to an end, and often it gets made into the end itself, or even if it's not a means to an end, that it's like they don't make it the end itself. It's definitely more than just a tool than if anything. So that was just my first thoughts on that. And
right. Well, I guess America specifically, right, is very much founded on a sort of the self-made man image, right? And so politics, in that sense, like because the nature of America doesn't have anything really transcendent, right? Or maybe like concept of freedom and stuff, right? It might be a transcendent thing in America, but it kind of does work as a highest authority if you don't think about other like transcendent things, right? Because it's so like it's effective and like it's about power, right? And so it does make sense that you see it become such an idol nowadays, right? Because it just seems like the natural thing to focus the most on. If you don't have a good prayer life, I guess, right?
Yeah, and it helps that it's basically reality TV. So.
Yes, that was my.
That was such a toss-up. I was like,
well, it's reality TV, especially nowadays, right? Because back 50, 60 years ago, like it wasn't the way it is now, right? I mean, maybe social media has something to do with it. But like now that you get like comical characters running for office, it's like Yeah. Anyway, sorry. That was
No, that's fair. That was actually a really good point because we're just looking at our previous recording, which I guess will actually be posted after this. And you could kind of see how the AI like on this app basically cut it into different sections and like transcribed the entire conversation. It's kind of terrifying actually.
I for one welcome our AI overlord.
Right. But it was cool to see how like it already optimized like the entirety of the podcast for things like YouTube Shorts or like Instagram Shorts and things like that, and that really hits at the heart of like the reason why politics is like kind of people view it as kind of a clown show nowadays, or like it has become more ridiculous. Is like even what you said at the start of the podcast, it was like be yourself, but be a more exagged version of yourself.
Don't
like
tell them. I said no.
People
This is exactly how
this
it
is
is.
right. People don't have the attention span nowadays with all the information that's coming in to like remember long arguments or to like even try and like go into the depth of like things. Like so a lot of people don't even listen to like podcasts or like long form media anymore because they're like, I don't know, like 30 minutes. Who's got 30 minutes to like actually think about something?
Intellectuals who will be listening to us.
Exactly. Right.
The funny joke is that it's just us.
Yeah.
The timeline for this is all weird. Yeah.
Right, but like again, people don't have the desire to like get into the depth of it or like ask the interesting questions about it, and so they're like, okay, what like 30-second tagline can I like put screaming on this like YouTube header just to like get people's attention or to like shock people into like maybe voting for me or.
And I think even the bigger
and it works evidently. Right?
At the same time, like no one stops and thinks. I feel like about like the foundational why we do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
And so like when we talk about like what's the role of politics in the society, like people don't think of that. They just think of it as like it's what affects my life, or it's for my president, or like that one. In a sense, it's like why do I want someone in office? Is to make society into this image basically, and like and in some sense like voting with that in mind, where I feel like sometimes it's turned into just like, oh well, I don't like that person or this one issue or like whatever it may be is why you vote. And,
Yeah, I think it's very important to just realize again, like we talked about, like the first thing you think about politics is a mean to an end, and it's for the good of civil society, right?
Right.
And the implication is that is like it's for the good of society. Like you're doing the only reason that politics are in place is because you want what's good for society. Like it shouldn't be a power grab. It shouldn't like be a riches grab. It shouldn't elicit anything else, right? Like public servants should be public servants, right?
Yeah.
Because like if you happen to get power or get wealth doing it, that's kind of a normal thing that happens when you enter those positions. So like it's not a bad thing to accumulate power or wealth while you're in them, but when that becomes your main goal and your main motivator, that's no longer a good reason to be in politics or to follow politics. Like if you're just voting whichever way makes you wealthier, you're voting whichever way gives you more power, whether you are a voter or someone in office, you lose the sight of why politics is there, which is to benefit civil society, right? Like to keep us safe, to keep the countries like orderly, to help the poor. Yeah. That's why politics and the government exists, right? Definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
I gotta say, especially a thing in the United States, right, where sort of relating to the idea of no transcendence in the United States. A lot of countries have had like an actual like a person that runs the country, but also like a figurehead, right? But we don't have that. We have the same person that both of those things, right? And so that's probably sort of why it gets all like ridiculous, because they have to be a sort of symbolic person, right, for the country, but they also have to actually run the country, right? Yeah. So those skills probably aren't like the same skills, right?
It's like being an engineer and a salesman at the same time.
Right,
you have to present yourself well, but you also have to have technical knowledge that helps you.
Yeah, and so the people that are like charismatic, that can like really arrest the attention of the crowds, aren't always the most meticulous, like rule setters, right? So that's probably a reason a lot of the a lot of the chaos we have in the United States. I mean, I guess other countries have the same problems, though.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's a good point, man. I want to shift a little bit now to talking about like the difference between moral law and civil law, right? So like, moral law obviously is in line with God's thought, right? Like moral law is Jesus Christ, right? Like he's the fulfillment of the law, and he's the one that dictates what we should follow as Christians in our life. And then comparing and contrasting that with civil law, which is not an infallible good, because moral law is obviously an infallible good. But civil law can be an infallible good if it aligns perfectly with moral law, but more often it doesn't. And an important distinction that, like, in America, at least, which is important, is that moral law is not a democracy, right? Whereas civil law is. And so moral law doesn't change. Moral, like Christ and God and the Holy Spirit, they're unchanging, right? Like they don't flip their opinions. But I mean, civil law, if enough people agree, anything can become a law or cease to be a law. Right?
And it's even like it's interesting where like, ideally you live in that perfect society, but the same like that where the moral and civil are the same, but it's like it gets very difficult for, I feel like, for a lot of Christians, maybe specifically Catholics, is like, where does that, in like our country, where should that line be drawn? Because especially in the United States, there's this huge, the whole idea of separation of church and state, which is like it's a very core belief that a lot of people have in our country, and that even the Constitution, like itself, kind of like tries to leave a separation about like prohibiting what you can and can't believe and practice and stuff. So it's like it gets to a really gray area of like where and how much of those overlap, and like whereas ideally they would entirely overlap. That kind of.
But we can't force people to adhere to our faith, obviously. And even if we did, it wouldn't be like genuine. So
and it's even and a lot of the moral law, I mean, it flows from, like Aaron was saying, from Jesus Christ. So if like if like you for whatever reason reject who Jesus is, then like it doesn't make sense to follow that moral law.
Right.
So like it's just like to have that overlap is like it has to start from Christ and then come down, and you can't force that upon people.
Exactly.
To accept that.
Sorry, Steve.
No, you're good. I don't know if you had anything. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think it's very important for people to recognize that, like, it's not necessarily our responsibility, like you were saying, to force civil law to coincide with moral law.
Right.
But it's very, very important to realize that they are two separate things, and to acknowledge how they're separate, and to not put your eggs in the basket of civil law. Because like I think it's important to fight for abortion rights, right? Like no
fight
Christian
for the pro-life cause. Yeah.
Sorry. I was worded very poorly. But it's important to fight for the overturning, like people fought for the overturning of Roe v. Wade for a very long time, and that was a really important struggle. But the legal changing of it is a cause for celebration, but it doesn't change anything about the moral law, and it also doesn't. It shouldn't be the force which catapults someone towards or away from the Christian faith, because again, whether abortion is legal or illegal, we're still called not to do it anyway.
No,
Right. So if it proceeds from moral law, just because abortion is legal doesn't mean that we should do it. Right? And that's kind of where the whole overlap part takes.
Right. Right. Because separating church and state doesn't mean you pretend there's no God when you vote. Right. It means I can't say because the church says X, the law must also say X. Yeah. I mean, I think the reason it was so emphasized back in the founding of the country is because we were breaking off from England, right? And England has a national church, or still does, right?
Yeah.
And so it is important to realize, right? The lack of separation of church and state doesn't mean. Separation of church and state doesn't mean you're an atheist when you vote. It means the church and the state are distinct entities, which they were not back in colonial times.
Right.
So that's the important thing to fight against. The thing when people say separation, when some people say separation of church and state nowadays, they mean stop thinking about God.
Right.
So,
Exactly. And that even flows into, I feel like a lot of Americans find the issue where a lot of their political beliefs form that moral law belief,
Right,
or even what belief of the church. And it was that whole idea that I've like begun to realize, it came from like a really interesting conversation with the Anglican priest who himself was noticing that like with his congregation, that a lot of it is like, especially in some of the Protestant base where it's very democratic, that like their beliefs in some sense come from the political realm into the faith, whereas like, it should be the complete other way around, is our moral faith forms that foundation for what the civil law should do. And like you were saying, I think it's important to, like, we don't have to, because we can't force people to accept Christ and then accept the moral law and then make that our civil law. At the very least, though, I think we should fight as Catholics that the civil law never directly opposes.
Right.
That it should never be like, it can be like unclear and not have a rule on that scenario, but it should never be like forbidding the actual moral law.
It should never make it harder for you to be moral.
Exactly. That's the best.
Maybe it doesn't stop you from being immoral, right? But yeah, it shouldn't work against you.
Yeah. And that is one of the most important points of this whole thing, is that your political beliefs should not form your faith. Your faith should inform everything else in your life. I mean, that is again a really, really important part of American society now. Like, the polarization between specifically the Democratic and the Republican Party is basically an attempt to divide everyone into one of those two groups, and they're just continually moving further and further away from each other on every issue. And it's almost impossible to put yourself on the political spectrum anywhere else without offending one or the other, right? Like, I can't say, like, I'm Republican in the way that I support everything that the Republican Party does, and I also definitely can't say that I'm a Democrat in the way that I support everything that the Democratic Party does. And you can say you vote one way or the other, and then everyone kind of auto-fills in.
Right, it's like, it's reductionist.
Oh, you're a raging like Republican, or you're a raging Democrat.
Right. Yeah.
But that's not how Catholics are, for the most part, called. Like, it's a very much a trap by the devil to try and reduce someone's ideology or personality to something that's less than what it is.
Yeah. Like, anything that, like, its main function is to divide people is generally a bad thing.
Right. Yeah.
Not generally. I think it's always
it is bad.
And I think politics nowadays is verging in that direction, right? I think there's a study that came out recently that, like, especially among like Gen Z people, it's like men and women specifically are like, on average, right, are just hyper like polarized nowadays. So that's a bad thing. That's probably not a very good thing, right? So, but yeah, have y'all seen? Would y'all say you've seen many like instances of politics sort of infiltrating like church life?
I feel like you see. I feel like I've not personally seen it. I feel like especially in our culture setting, place we live, being in Texas, that kind of definitely has like its own sense. There is definitely some, even in the terms of like the Republican ideology influencing the Catholic mindset, but like you kind of see it vaguely, but I don't know if I see it like personally. You like see it in news articles and like stuff like that, but I feel like for the most part, just based on our setting, it's not as.
I do think Catholics are probably less susceptible to this, I think, than Protestants are, because a lot of Protestant churches in America are like pretty explicitly just political, right?
Yeah.
You ever passed any like Republican Baptist church?
No.
Like, it's a thing. I passed them. Yeah, and a lot of there's a branch of Christianity, not a branch, but there's a Christian ideology nowadays that's called progressive Christianity, right? And so it's like they're clearly like politics with Christian aesthetics on, and that's backwards.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I'd say about that. I guess in our circles, maybe I know some people who like support the death penalty, like as Catholics. Which I mean, I think you technically are allowed to do, right?
The Catholic Church actually just reversed its, or not reversed, but like they changed their position on the death penalty like maybe 2012.
It was relatively recent.
It was
I know,
Francis, because
right.
he basically, I think it was, I'm pretty sure it was Francis.
Okay.
Maybe it was like 2012.
From what I understand, it's not that it's intrinsically immoral.
Yeah.
It's that nowadays, because we can properly like contain
Secure
people,
yeah, it's unnecessary.
there's no reason to.
Yeah, because he wasn't talking about like self-defense or anything
Right,
like that.
yeah.
He was just talking about like prisons deliberately giving people lethal injection, essentially. So,
And like back a long time ago, when there were just like villages and stuff with like maybe stockyards, right? Like you might have to if you can't. Like,
yeah,
right.
Yeah,
But nowadays, like there are prisons no one can get out of. So.
Yeah. To answer your question earlier, I think one of the biggest places that I've seen the influence of the political dip into religious for myself is financially.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a really big difference in the political sphere between like you got social issues and you got economic issues,
right.
and those are the two main splits. And I think a lot of times like people feel more freedom to take to one side or the other as Catholics or as Christians with the financial issues because they're less attached.
You
to
can have left or right wing
exactly
and be a faithful Catholic.
Right. Yeah, they're less attached to the moral law than societal impacts are. So that's definitely some place where like I'll see just like people not wanting to be generous with what they have, and there's kind of like a hardness there that to me at least, it seems like it's been brought on by a lot of the political ideology and just like more so like whenever someone asks for your money, people just kind of see it as another extension of like the government, right?
Right.
Or like don't want to like stretch themselves to offer that, which is like I mean
presumption about what the money will be.
Right, and that's also like fine, but it's like again, it's one of those kind of what we were talking about in the last like thing is it's a calling as a Christian, right? But it's like something that you're called to develop on your own, and like regardless of whether the government takes care of the poor or whether it doesn't, like whatever the civil law is, you're called again to reenact the moral law, and you're called to be generous in the way that you believe is best for you and your family, right? Like I'm not called to give a lot of money right now because I don't have a lot of money because I have to take care of my wife. But like if that wasn't the case and I had a buttload of money, I should discern how I can be more generous with it. So, maybe an old tangent. So I want to go in a little bit, unless you all had any comments here. I want to go a little bit into the civil rights movement, kind of with the whole civil law.
Why?
Just like how well that was done at that point. Like MLK was like a great figure, and obviously he knew the texts of Aquinas and Augustine and a lot of church fathers very, very well. And he very much pioneered, at least in America, the idea of civil disobedience, right?
Yeah.
Like it was his thought that like in order to stay true to the virtue of obedience, like I must be obedient to the civil law, right? Like if it says if I sit, in this diner, I will go to jail, and yet I'm also upheld by a higher level of obedience to the moral law, which I know is that in their case, Black people have every right the same as everyone else, right? Like they have the same amount of human dignity as every other human who's on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so his way of being able to reconcile, like, I'm going to be disobedient deliberately to this civil law that I know is wrong, and yet I'm still exercising the virtue of obedience in his case, going to prison, right? Kind of in a St. Paul epic kind of way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, when we talked about, you brought up St. Paul, and I had not kind of equated in a lot of the early Christians the fact of like the civil disobedience as a way to like the incredible obedience that it is in the sense of like being obedient to a moral law and like even the accepting the punishments like faithfully and like recognizing that this civil government was instituted by God, and even in that sense like it has those laws that like are completely against our like the higher moral law, but understanding that like they still have that power to provide that judgment. It was really I never thought of St. Paul in that lens. Like when I heard like MLK, I was like, yeah, I could like get down that lens, but St. Paul in that lens is also, and all the early Christians who even the early martyrdom, the like willingness to the the martyr, like to then be that witness for the faith, but also
Right.
like the obedience there is. Like it was just a really cool.
Yeah, the willingness to go to the
Yeah, because that was what was like proclaimed.
Right.
But,
Yeah. I feel like nowadays there aren't a lot of occasions for that simply though, unless y'all have something.
Well, I mean, not in our part of the world for sure, but I mean,
Right.
I mean, people talk about this all the time. There are more martyrs now than there ever were
Right,
in the early
yeah.
church, but just in different countries that we're not as privy
Yeah.
to.
and I think it even in some sense it talks about the opposite in our the United States, American, like where there isn't too much that directly prohibits from you following the moral law. So in that sense, the call to obedience that you are given to the obedience of like silly things like the speed limit or like
Right.
like the speed limit has like
That Matthew thinks the speed limit is ridiculous.
right.
Well, paying my taxes.
Paying your taxes. But like there's no moral implication necessarily if you're going 5 over the speed limit.
Right.
But like it is in some sense like a civil obedience that like you're called to in some ways.
Yeah, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
I know it's kind of an L for my young libertarian phase, right? I realized the only thing Jesus said about economic policies was pay your taxes. So that's like, oh man.
And it is a good segue to always obviously like take it back to Christ, right? Like the example of Christ is literally one of like you can see that mirrored in the way that MLK tried to live his life, and also like all the early saints and martyrs, right? Like Jesus never backed down from his claim that he was God because he is God, right?
Right.
He was never like, oh, like yeah, sure, I'll stop saying God, you don't kill me, right? Like,
Right.
But he broke the civil law of Rome and of the Jews as well,
Right.
very deliberately, and he knew what he was doing, and he still, God himself, still willingly went to his death under the authority of Pontius Pilate
Right.
and of the church Pharisees,
Caiaphas, yeah,
Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, and yeah, like he allowed them to exercise authority over him from a civil standpoint, and went to his death willingly, right? Like
Right.
That's literally, that is the heart of the gospel, and like that's the core example that's provided there in the way of civil disobedience.
Right.
Again, his point is not civil disobedience, to be
Right,
clear,
right.
but that is a very good
Right.
connection that we can
How
have from
The
the
gospel
gospel.
message is supposed to be above the earthly politics, right?
Right.
Even though it plays along with it.
It still influences what we're supposed to believe about.
I think y'all know what liberation theology is, right?
No.
Maybe you don't. Okay, so liberation theology was I think it was in Argentina. It was in Latin America. It started in Latin America. It was founded by a Dominican priest, Father something Gutierrez. I don't know exactly his name. But it's a bad thing generally. It places a lot of emphasis on it places a lot of emphasis on the poor, the oppressed, which the gospel does, but it equates salvation towards making things better for on earth for poor people, right? And so I think that's where you look at Jesus' trial, right? How the guilty parties are both the oppressors and the downtrodden class, right? Because it's not about your earthly politics primarily.
Yeah.
And I think that's the answer to pretty much all of it, right? It's don't let the earthly structures get in the way of your spiritual growth, right?
Yeah, and it's the opposite party may win the election and they really disappoint you, but that shouldn't affect your prayer life. Or that ultimately joy in your life is founded on your faith.
Right.
That foundation is and that's definitely I think what you're getting at. It's exactly correct. That is ultimately the end of your life.
Yeah. I think really the last thing that I just want to touch on is just kind of the aspect of just connect it back to the Bible a little bit more, and just talk about how Jesus as the moral law, right? The fulfillment of, I think it's more of just a cool point for me of Jesus is the fulfillment of the old law as the new law, right?
Right.
And he talks very vividly in the Bible about not allowing the old law to pass away. And yet, we as Catholics don't observe the old law, right?
Yeah.
We're not Pharisees and we're not Jewish in that way anymore because we don't we don't abstain from
We're not Jewish.
pork. Like, I mean, we don't build tabernacles in the same way that's laid out in the book of Deuteronomy. Like, we don't do any of that stuff anymore.
Not for making a podcast on
Right, exactly. But it kind of looks a little strange, but you kind of recognize that, like, even with the old law was the most perfect way that God could convey a sort of civil law to his people, right? And yet you still see, like, in the New Testament when Jesus talks about, like, Moses was the main, like, prophet of the old law, right? He's the guy who wrote most of that down, or at least talked about it, right? And, he talks about how Moses allowed people to get divorced, right? And, like, Jesus condemns that explicitly in the Gospels, and that was, like, part of the old law, right? And it just shows how no matter what, the civil law is, because of the hardness of human hearts and our propensity to sin, it's never going to be fully aligned with God's law, even when it's as close as it possibly can be. Mm-hmm. And also that God's law in that regard was more of a civil law, whereas Jesus stands more of the eternal law, right? Like, that was intended to help separate their hearts from the idolatry to the Egyptians and, allow them to give a good life. Whereas, again, Jesus is coming as, it's just me, Like, Jesus is just everything. Like, there's no translation needed. There's no, like, differences there. There's no, like, one needs to, like, kind of come into the other or anything like that. Like, Jesus is just the new law himself.
Yeah, and I think even, like, when you're talking about that, the interesting point of, like God the Father gave the Israelites the civil law in a way to reveal his own moral law. Mm-hmm. And, like, in a way, like, in some sense, there is a slight role of that. Like, whereas, like, the moral law is truth, is what it is, but, like going back, like, the civil law, like, if it is truly serving its purpose, it should reveal some of the moral law to the citizens. And, like, like, how many people, like, killing is bad from a very little age because that's, in some sense, it's against the law. Yeah. But in the same way, like, if that's what it takes to reveal the moral law, that's a very, like, good thing. And that's how the Lord chose to do it in the Old Testament, right? To, like, reveal some of the moral law through the civil law of the, like, Israel.
I think even the United States Declaration of Independence specifically says our right to come from God, right? Yeah. And it's actually, I think, relatively unique. Most other countries' constitutions or whatever will say we grant these rights, and it's not like explicitly like God exists. Just the language used is because of the government. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the great things about America is that we recognize America as a state does recognize that government politics is a means to it, even if people in it fail to do that. Right. So that's why I think we Americans are kind of at a privileged position, I think, in that regard. So we can't. That's why it gets even worse when we do it. Yeah. Let's see. Do you have anything else?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
I was going to say,
Oh, I did want to clarify one thing. I'm not calling the Old Testament law a civil law exclusively, but it was not the fullness of the law. That was more what I was intending to say there.
Right.
Okay. It is still divine law.
Right.
But it is intended for a different purpose than the coming of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is all
right. Do we want to talk about any, like, voting guideline? I mean, obviously we're not going to say vote for this person or the other, but I mean, I think it's a bad idea.
Yeah, not really. I think so. Okay. Most of the Catholic is just vote your conscience.
Vote your conscience. Yeah.
Like,
I know Pope Francis said
pray
recently,
about who you're going to vote for. Like, that's not. We were talking, like, last time. Like, prayer is the foundation of everything. Yeah. Right? Like,
you mean next time?
Next time. Sure. Yeah. Time travel. Yeah. Let your prayer inform your political decisions. Right. Your faith should be the foundation of everything that you do.
Right.
Yeah.
I know Pope Francis said recently that both candidates suck. So.
I didn't say that directly.
Yeah. Good luck out there on the polls.
Yeah.
Oh. Make sure. Is it Wall Street or maybe it's
It's got to be.
Get your money.
You start doing a like and subscribe thing yet?
No. Make sure to smash that like button.
Yeah. So we can get what is it? ads for
Ads. Oh, we're a long way. We're a long way from
sponsored by Word and Fire.
No, that would be Hallow first.
Hallow.
Cool. All right.
Right,
So
well,
just
yeah,
cut it
thanks for
off
coming
there.
by.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. You might see that again sometime. Yeah. 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 Okay.